Hey guys, what's happening? So now as we get into the conclusion of the death of Dick Grayson, which I really wouldn't so much call a conclusion, because after we finish this and then revisit Nightwing, or the Nightwing series I should say, there are a lot of things that carry over that are vastly different than prior to the point when he was shot back in DC Rebirth Batman issue number 55. But even with that said, there are a couple big payoffs that I wanted to talk about that we'll get to through the course of this video. So if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so as a quick little recap, since the events of Batman issue number 55, where Dick Grayson was shot in the head by KG Beast, which had an interesting effect on his memory, because the memory that he lost, it was more so the middle stages of his life, because he remembers much of his childhood and more of his recent years, but pretty much when it comes to his years as Robin, his years as Nightwing, and I guess his time as Agent Grayson, if that's still a thing. Haven't seen many references to that lately, so I'm not really sure. We may get a reference later, I have no clue. But the combination of those recent and distant memories, they give towards the explanation of why he can walk and talk, and although he goes by the name Rick now, he understands that he was once referred to by Dick Grayson, which is a bit of the logic behind the name Rick, because this time around with a lot of these memories gone, he feels a lot lighter, and it's almost like a burden's been lifted. And though he still acknowledges that he's Richard Grayson, and he has every intention of being true to who he is, but now with going by Rick, which is still short for Richard instead of Dick, it's really just him leading into that decision to choose a different path and make his attempt to move forward in life. And so now along with his attempt, he eventually found his way to his hideout within Bloodhaven, within the abandoned subway tunnels of which he attempted to burn down, which was really him trying to just erase Nightwing altogether. But in his attempt to burn everything down, like everything got destroyed except for the suits, which I guess Richard forgot was in fireproof glass apparently. But from here is where it was discovered by Detective Sapienza, to whom we had talked about in the previous video was one of the first responders, and with them quickly realizing what this place actually was, and also realizing that whoever was Nightwing was the person who did this. And really Sapienza just pieced together that whoever was Nightwing, they most likely just walked away, but Bloodhaven still needs a Nightwing, and that's when he had taken the suits and formed his own team. And so now as for Rick Grayson, through the course of his rehabilitation, he had foreseen counseling with Dr. Gruity, who was actually Jonathan Crane, the Scarecrow, and they did a bit of their dance around the specifics to conceal each of their specific identities, but it was through the course of this time that Dr. Gruity, if you will, he had more or less diagnosed Rick Grayson as someone who was not susceptible to fear, which also leads into the reason that he's here in Bloodhaven in the first place, because he later describes it like he has a purpose of lifting the veil of civilization off of the people's eyes, and after having his counseling sessions with Rick Grayson, he sees an example of what the people could be. And so I gotta add in here, like prior to this point, and going back for a second to Scott Snyder and James Tynion, Batman and Robin Eternal, and mainly doing so because back at this time we had got another flashback to the first time that Batman and Robin, with Dick Grayson being Robin at the time, but within this story we had got another flashback of the two of them meeting the Scarecrow, to where if I'm not mistaken, for Dick Grayson during his time as Robin, the Scarecrow was his first supervillain. So it makes sense now, fast forward 4 or 5 years in DC Rebirth, to bring him back as a main stake in the Nightwing story, because even now with this change that's happening with Richard Grayson, you can tell that Scott Lobdell is kind of chiming in at some of the things that we had seen as far as the dynamic between Richard Grayson and Scarecrow that we had got a glimpse of back in Batman and Robin Eternal, where we had also seen Richard Grayson not susceptible to the fear gas. And even though at the time Snyder and Tynion were expanding on that event by bringing in additional things happening around it in order to tell a bigger story about Batman keeping secrets from Dick Grayson, and how Batman was actually using the Scarecrow to achieve a bigger objective, of which Dick Grayson didn't find out till many years later. But I wanted to mention him because it's also likely that these play into the memories of Dr. Gruity, aka Dr. Jonathan Crane, who mentioned that Rick reminded him of Robin, who was also without fear. And so now the crazy thing is, at this point, Detective Elise Silverboda, who's your lead detective from Bloodhaven Police Department, and her history with Nightwing is even more so to the point to where she tolerates him more so than she agrees with the whole vigilante thing. But at this point in time, she approaches Dr. Gruity at his apartment, asking him to step in and ask him a couple of questions, and doing so mainly because she noticed after some of these isolated instances that when she looked into Dr. Gruity, she couldn't find any previous practices where he had worked prior to coming to Bloodhaven. And what's crazy, he invites her in, and when she asked him where he worked previously, he's like, oh yeah, Gotham. And she's like, that's funny, I don't see anything under your name name in Gotham, did you work under a different name maybe? And he's just like, oh yes, Crane. And it throws her off guard because he's just like, you know what, let's cut the crap. I know why you wanted to come in here. You want to see what kind of crazy stuff I got in here because you know who I am and you knew you was gonna come in here and find something. And when he lets her in, he opens the door to another room to where she sees the body that's been there for the longest. And for us the reader, like, this is the body that he's been talking to since like issue 50 whenever he does his monologues. But for Scarecrow, at this point he knew eventually Detective Savoda or somebody would come knocking on his door, either from connecting him to using his fear toxin on his patients here in Bloodhaven, or even his new fear germ formula which he's been using on dead bodies, of which he had previously anticipated would have killed her and everyone else at the time that the body was given an autopsy. But nonetheless, he's impressed that she made it this far, and he concludes that that form of his toxin just needs a minor adjustment. But from here he just leaves her there, assuming that her neck is broken, because at this point she's heavily under the influence of his fear toxin, and just at the sound of hearing her neck pop, which could have just been when he grabbed her, but from just hearing that sound she's terrified that her neck is broken and she's crippled with fear. But after leaving her there, Scarecrow then continues to release his toxin throughout Bloodhaven, and following through with the conclusion of the assessment that he made with Rick Grayson, believing that he can make the people there stronger by helping them overcome their fears. And while he's doing this, at this time it just so happens to be Malcolm Hutch, his night for patrol, as a member of the new Team Nightwing, and he's one of the first to see this chaos go underway, so immediately he informs the others that they have to do something. And so now as for Rick, who is at the bar with Beatrice Bennett, who at this time is like his love interest of sorts, it's still in the puppy love kind of phase, but is escalating pretty quickly. But while he's here, which is where he spends most of his time when he's not cab driving, Beatrice goes out back to take out the trash, and that's when the chaos from the streets makes its way to the bar. And at this point in time, the people who have been infected with the fear toxin, they just keep chanting, "I am not afraid," and they foaming at the mouth and just beating the mess out of each other. And it's almost like an old Bone Crusher video. But so when Rick hears the commotion out back, he immediately runs out there, helping Beatrice and knocking a few of these guys out. And for Beatrice, this is all new because this is her first time seeing Rick even move like this. But for him, once again, it's just muscle memory. He's just doing what he feels like he needs to do. And one of the things to keep in mind, even though a majority of the memories from the mid part of his life, even though many of them are very cloudy, recently some of them have been coming back. And a lot of that has to do with either familiar places that he sees in Bloodhaven, or even at times when his muscle memory kicks in and he has to defend himself, or even if there's a moment of something that seems to be a traumatizing incident that also could potentially bring back a memory that prior to this point he had lost. And so from here he tells Beatrice and everyone else to stay inside the bar, and he blocks them in there, and he continues to go out and just contribute to see either who else he can help, but also try to figure out what exactly is going on. And aside from the Nightwing muscle memory moves, Rick pursues an interest to get to the bottom of whatever this is, mainly because he still feels this part of him that's pushing him to do it, and as he walks into it, he's experiencing more and more that he has the capability to do so. And so now at this point in time, when Team Nightwing arrives, and man, let me tell you about these guys, bro. Like, they are not experienced, and we are about to see that in action. Like, for them, the idea of being a superhero and fighting off hundreds of people without killing them, because at one point Colleen was just like, well, yo, can we just start shooting people? I mean, because at the end of the day, they probably be like, the toxicity got so high that a bullet wound just appeared. Like, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. But no, really, like, the Scarecrow, he realizes really quickly that this is amateur night, because among this group, Zach Edwards, who is Colleen Edwards' younger brother, when he sees his sister Colleen get bust upside the head with a trash can, he leaps to take a swing at Scarecrow and not really so much paying attention to his surroundings. And at this point, Rick is watching from afar off like, that is a bad move. Like, I might not remember everything, but Nightwing would never do that. And when Zach leaps out at the Scarecrow, he is immediately shot down. And once again, this just plays into the whole inexperience of this team. And granted, other members of the Bat family have been shot. Bruce has been shot, Rick has been shot, Barbara's been shot. And this is something that Barbara's even brought up in earlier issues of the Nightwing series, because prior to this point, she's brought that up to Rick in an earlier attempt to pull him back in and trying to make some type of connection to him, so that at the least he knows that she has at least an inkling of what he's going through right now. But my main point is this: with the whole Team Nightwing, which does not hold a candle to the Bat family. And not even just quote unquote your immediate Bat family, but I'm talking about everyone, including Alfred, because he's taken Superman more than once. And I don't care if it's a different reality, still Alfred. But with saying that, I would go even further to say that I don't think anybody would even make that mistake. And for that reason, I don't believe that Scott Lobdell is trying to pull that or push that idea, or even the possibility of making this team the Bat family, if you will, of Bloodhaven. But rather, I would say they're more so playing the role of showing Richard Grayson how important he was as Nightwing. Because when Zack gets shot, he immediately goes back to the memory of his family getting murdered and that feeling of being helpless. And when he gets that feeling again, he immediately goes to his cab and he just puts together what he can do with what he has. And so immediately with lighting the spare tire on fire, which kind of cancels out the fear toxin because it's activated when it's airborne and the CO2 just dilutes it. But from this point, he just takes random items out of the trunk and he's way more effective than any of these guys were collectively together. And it's really at this point where he joins in that he makes the decision to be some form of a hero because he feels responsible for these guys. And as sorry as they may be, their inspiration comes from him and he can't just let them die trying. I mean, he could, but you know, just be really messed up. But so now from here, Rick, he ends it fairly quickly because he follows the trail of the remaining fear toxin and it leads him right back to Scarecrow. But at this point, before it concludes, Scarecrow, he takes notice that this one individual out of everybody in the city is not affected by the fear toxin. Like, he's not wearing the gas mask or anything like that. He doesn't have on a rebreather, he's fine. And before they take him out, he clearly makes notice of that. And so they knock him out, Scarecrow's done for now, and you know Sapienza had to step up and get a hit in too, make it look like he did something. But I gotta say, in my concluding thoughts from reading this, and I know that the whole overall arc with Rick Grayson is not over. Like, this more so just ends the chapter of him deciding to be a hero again. But with reading this, I can't help but to think about the switch up between Benjamin Percy to Scott Lobdell, with Percy leaving because he didn't want to take this direction with Nightwing, which is why he left. But anyone writing Nightwing would have had to take in this direction and figured out a way for it to work, given that he had to have some form of amnesia and possibly other beats that he had to follow throughout the narrative. And mainly doing so it would be consistent with the events that had taken place coming from Batman issue 55 going into Nightwing issue 50, because as we're seeing as of recently, a lot of these events are pouring into more recent events like the Year of the Villain, and for that reason the lone standing titles have to keep their consistency. But in the case of Nightwing Man, and I'm gonna call him Nightwing Man because he Nightwing in my heart, I'm just gonna hang in there for him and see how it pans out. But I am super curious to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments below, because it hasn't been till recently that I've seen him mentioned even in DC Rebirth as far as Batman. And that was when Barb was just like, well, you know, Dick is still Rick, and that was about it. But let me know you guys' thoughts down in the comments below. Me personally, I feel like they're just stalling for something later, but I'd really like to hear the thoughts of some of you Nightwing fans as far as how you feel about your guy during this transition period. But let me know your thoughts down below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.